So if you're insulin sensitive first thing in the morning, that means those two tissues are both going to be competing for the material that you eat. And although it's hard for carbohydrates to be turned into body fat, carbohydrates make it a lot easier to store the fats in your system, to esterify the fatty acids into triglycerides for fat cell storage. So you're getting more raw material into the fat cells so that they can store even more fat. And then your muscles have to compete for that. And in the morning, they may not be in an optimal situation to do that. Whereas in the later part of the day, like we were talking about, and if we don't even talk about resistance training, that first half of the day with carbohydrates will actually decrease the enzymes necessary to get fat out of fat cells and will increase the enzymes necessary to get fat into fat cells, but it does the opposite in muscles. It actually decreases the ability to get fat into muscle cells and increases the ability for them to release. So even without exercise, you've set up this paradigm by eating carbohydrates in the first half of the day where your body fat especially, wants to store even more carbohydrates at night. Whereas when you take carbohydrates out of the diet, it does the exact opposite. It increases the enzymes that make fat cells get rid of fat, decreases their ability to store fat and carbs, and then muscle cells go through the opposite change. They're more apt to store intramuscular triglycerides and less apt to get rid of them at night. So you've got this situation where the healthiest tissue in your body is willing to store the fat that I would imagine you use for fuel the next day in your muscles, because that period without the carbohydrates is priming them to be better at using fat earlier in the next day. So you've got, even without resistance training, that's the scenario that's going on that I'm guessing is a huge component of why eating carbohydrates at night as opposed to the first half of the day works regardless.
Interesting.
If that wasn't too technical or
no, it's good. That was definitely. I'm gonna love when our transcriber goes through all that stuff. She's gonna be like, "Yeah, I'm done. I'm over this stuff." So we're talking about the potential of just having some kind of better optimized. Metabolic processes, a little bit of nutrient partitioning, ideally sticking calories and nutrients in a more optimum location, which ideally would be more within the muscles. And then you talk at length about the importance of resistance training and the way that will change nutrient partitioning. You make a strong argument for an afternoon training session or an AM training session, but that noon time is kind of like the no man's land. Could you talk a little bit about that stuff? And it's miserable for me because that's when I do jujitsu, like 3 or 4 days a week. And so I was like, damn it, So I'm in that completely non-optimizable spot. But could you talk about the advantages, disadvantages of like AM, later afternoon versus midday training?
Yeah, I'll start with the evening training because that's a good segue from what we were just talking about. One way to enhance that idea that you can stop fat cells from being able to store the sugar and fat as well, but shift it to muscle tissue is through there's the specialized proteins. I don't want to talk over the head of your audience necessarily, but they're the glucose transporters, and they're little proteins that sit on the cell, every cell in your body. And the type in muscle and fat tissue that's of really big interest are GLUT4s and GLUT12s. I just call them T-GLUT in my book. But usually what happens is insulin hits those cells, fat cells and muscle cells. These T-GLUT raise to the surface of the cells, and then the T-GLUT is what actually grabs the sugar, pulls it into the cell. Well, it turns out you don't need insulin to make those things translocate. It's called move from the inner part of the cell to the surface. And in muscle cells, all you have to do is resistance train. So if you lift heavy loads, and a key there is heavy load, although, anyway, I'll stay on this train of thought. The heavy load, I don't want to start turning this into a pretzel. The heavy loads increases GLUT4 translocation, which means, essentially, your muscle cells can soak up all the sugar that they want, and your fat cells can't if you do it later in the day. So you've just optimized your circadian rhythm to partition even more nutrients into your muscle cells instead of your fat cells. That's what's going on there. In the morning, you've got these really interesting kind of growth potentials that you don't have in the rest of the day. And I don't have an explanation for this. It just comes up in the research. If you resistance train first thing in the morning fasted, or we'll start with the resistance training. If you resistance train fasted first thing in the morning, if you take in just a little bit of carbohydrates after that training session, you actually get double the growth signals that you can any other time during the day. Which is one reason it's like if you have to train first thing in the morning, it's not that bad. And actually you do want to introduce a small amount of carbs. Again, you've created a situation where your muscles are more prone to store those carbs, still again limiting your fat's ability to do so. And you get this huge growth spike from it. So that's really interesting. And then doing cardio type activities first thing in the morning fasted mobilizes more body fat. It increases ketogenesis, although most exercise increases ketogenesis. But, it helps you burn more fat. You get a greater mobilization of free fatty acids. So you get kind of this twofold punch. You're burning more fat, and you're able to get a big growth potential after your training. In the middle of the day, the problem is there's just, as of right now, there's absolutely nothing we know about that you can take advantage of that middle part of the day. I mean, really, all you're going to do is screw up your hormones for the rest of the day, or, there's no kind of optimization that I've found yet there. So not that one doesn't exist, I don't know what it is.
So, right. Now, how would you define middle of the day? So is this based on an actual clock time, or is this relative to when people are actually rising and sleeping?
It would be relative to when they're rising and sleeping. So, your early AM fasted training should occur about within an hour of when you wake up. And then how I would end that window is after the first time you eat, no matter what it is you choose to eat. And then the end of that window is, again, it's different for everybody, but on average, I put the end of that window around 3 or 4 p.m. If you can start your training at 3 or 4 p.m., then you're back into a situation where you can optimize with your food.
Got it.
So, you just had Joel Jamieson on your podcast, which was phenomenal. I love that guy. Like, you guys were a great combo on that. But, let's say, we have a lot of folks that do CrossFit, that do MMA and jiu-jitsu and stuff like that. I've found within my own training, like I've tried doing just the carb backloading, which you make a great point on this, which I think is really important to point out. And it's something that I had kind of intuitively recommended for a long time. And again, it's just kind of validating to hear this from you. But, like today's carb meal should actually be oriented more towards what am I doing tomorrow and less focused on what did I just do today. And
right.
I think that's a huge thing. But I've found it really difficult to get the type of recovery that I need from just an evening carb load. I've felt like I've needed to do a couple of meals. Like, how are you tweaking things for somebody that's more of like a glycogen-dependent athlete, CrossFit, jiu-jitsu, kickboxing, MMA, and that sort of stuff? How are you tweaking things to help folks with that? Or what's kind of the rubric that you help people to figure out where they need to go to optimize their situation?
The first place I go is adding more backloads. So most people shouldn't backload every night. But if they find that their recovery is suffering or their energy levels, then I start having them add another night of backload. And then depending on their goals, where I go from that, especially MMA fighters, I've got an Olympic level judo competitor. What we start to do there is actually ratchet the carbohydrates back time-wise in the day. So they've got their carb backload after their training, but they'll actually do something to spike insulin levels without a big glucose spike about 20 minutes at the beginning of their training. And so usually do that with leucine. Protein hydrolysates are really good at that. So they'll get a little insulin spike, and then they'll start training. And about 15, 20 minutes into the training, they introduce a carbohydrate-based shake, and they will sip that or drink that at whatever level they need to throughout the rest of the workout. And then if they need even more carbohydrates, which I found in very few instances, but some people have, then I'll actually introduce about an hour before that a meal that's pretty high fat and carbs. So like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches are kind of the go-to for most people, but anything peanut butter and bananas, something like that. So those are the steps I take. First, add another backload during the week, or maybe add one carb night during the week. Just have one night where you go all out to try to replenish those things. And then from there, I'll start ratcheting it back during the day to help compensate for that. And one of the best ones I found, and John Meadows uses this somewhat intuitively, is he backloads in a sense. He trains in the evening, but he introduces all of his carbs almost during the workout, and then really has not many carbs afterwards. And that's what he does when he's prepping for a contest, and he feels good the whole time. It almost looks like he puts on muscle. I'm not sure that he does, but he stays full, he stays like muscular, and he stays in good spirits by doing that. So there's just so many scenarios. Right. The basic process, like I said, is add another carb backload, and then maybe start ratcheting those carbohydrates back further in the day.
Interesting. Okay. Which is kind of counterintuitive. If folks are feeling some recovery issues, you would almost think that they would start, say like sticking in a little bit of carbs with breakfast or something along that line. But that's interesting.
Yeah, I pretty much keep if you eat carbs in the morning, you've pretty much changed completely the hormonal paradigm for the rest of the day. I mean, they've even shown just eating a bowl of oatmeal in the morning literally raises triglyceride levels all day long. I mean, so if you want to adopt a paradigm like that, you really do have to watch the saturated fat you eat, because you've created a situation that's an increased heart attack risk for the rest of the day. So you can't eat fat the rest of the day if you want to have that high carbohydrate, low fat breakfast.
Gotcha.
It's just so I always try to keep carbs out of that morning cycle, unless, like I said, what does seem to work really well, and I've used this primarily with competitors, so I can't say how it works in the general public so well, but when they train first thing in the morning, that little bit of carbs after their training, which is usually just an overripe banana, helps them lean out and keeps them consistent through the rest of their preparation cycle.
The overripe banana, that's a really interesting piece of the carb backloading methodology that you use, which is so counterintuitive for the vast majority of folks and everything that we're getting out of kind of mainstream media, which is, historically the recommendation is to eat these slow release carbs. To whatever degree people will get in and talk about the insulin and the issues with insulin. So the recommendation is this slow release carb, so that you get a long period of release, even though the area under the curve ends up frequently being larger than even the insulin spike, which is, I think, the point that you made in there. But you actually make the recommendation of some pretty processed carbs or low, in paleo land, we would look more at like ripe bananas, white potatoes, sweet potatoes, but even the sweet potatoes maybe being a little bit high in fiber and or fructose. But you make the point that you're better off just getting that carb in and out. Get the insulin pulse, get it partitioned and done. Like, talk about that a little bit. That is so counterintuitive for what most people are talking about. Like, you tune into Dr. Oz and it's like, eat beans because it'll keep your blood sugar up for 8 hours. Like...
Right. That was an amazing Dr. Oz impression, by the way.
Oh, well, thank you.
Eat beans.
That guy, man, I watched one full episode of that and it almost killed me. I thought I was just going to die.
I watched a few minutes with Gary Taubes on there, and I was just, it was horrible.